So welcome everyone to the panel on rural environmental impacts. I'm Jessica Schad. I'm an associate professor of rural communities and natural resource sociology at Utah State University. And I am going to introduce our panel of three speakers. So first we'll have Dr. Tim Slack, who is a professor of sociology at Louisiana State University. His scholarship focuses on the areas of social stratification, social demography, community and environment, and rural sociology. An overarching theme of his research is on space and place as axes of inequality. His presentation today will focus on land loss in Louisiana and how this is a rural-urban interface issue. Our second presenter will be Dr. Rochelle Winkler, who is a professor of sociology and demography at Michigan Technological University. Her research is focused on spatial inequality, including patterns of residential segregation and distributions of social and environmental resources with a focus on rural places. Her presentation today will focus on amenity migration in the rural United States, so leading well off what Dr. Johnson just spoke about, and focusing specifically since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we also have Dr. Tom Miller, who is a research assistant professor of geography and environmental sustainability at the University of Oklahoma. He is a rural sociologist and demographer whose work focuses on inequality, health, and well-being in rural America. Today, he's going to be talking to us about his research on issues related to water infrastructure access and quality in rural America. So, Dr. Slack, we'll have you kick off the panel.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, my name is Tim Slack, and I'm at LSU. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is land loss in coastal Louisiana, a rural-urban population interface issue. And as was mentioned before, we were asked to do lightning talks, and as a professor, I don't do a lot at lightning speed, so I'm going to stick to my notes here a little bit. So the population of coastal Louisiana is under tremendous pressure. We have rapid land loss that's being driven by the combined effects of sea level rise on the one hand and subsidence on the other. Subsidence being the sinking of land due to changes underground. Since the 1930s, Louisiana has lost over 2,000 square miles of its coast. That's an area roughly the size of the state of Delaware. Moreover, Louisiana is projected to lose more than twice that amount of land by 2050 without significant action. One of the issues we have is that from 2010 to 2020, the population of Louisiana grew at a very modest rate of 2.7%, but the population change across the state was really uneven. In the state's coastal zone, which is our 20 parishes in the coastal portion of our state, we have parishes instead of counties. In the 20 parishes in the coastal portion of our state, the population grew by 5.8%. Now, some of that disproportionate growth in the coastal zone can be attributed to repopulation in the southeastern portion of Louisiana in the 10 years following Hurricane Katrina. But at this point, that population, that change has really played out. Nonetheless, as of 2020, fully half of the state population of Louisiana resides in the coastal zone parishes, 50.5% of the state's population. The figure that I have up here shows coastal Louisiana land loss in 2050 with 2 feet of sea level rise. This is estimated to be an intermediate to low rise scenario, a relatively conservative estimate, according to data from NOAA and NASA. The figure really makes clear the magnitude of the land loss problem. If you think about Louisiana being shaped like a boot, what you can see is that we're rapidly losing the sole of the boot with particular deterioration in the toe. Most of the population centers in Louisiana are located along the Interstate 10 and 12 corridors, which you can see up here, traveling from the west to the east. These are places like New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Lafayette, and Lake Charles. But the areas along the coast proper are really rural in character. So the areas that are closest to the coast that are really rural in character. As coastal Louisiana grapples with the impacts of land loss, rural and small town communities are really on the front line with this environmental change, really on the front line of the fight. However, as the water pushes further inland, this is increasingly a rural-urban interface issue. You can see how this water is projected to move towards, over these rural areas and towards our major urban centers. Why does this all matter? I mean, it matters for a lot of reasons. Land loss is increasing risk from hurricanes and non-storm flooding. Our hurricanes are getting bigger and stronger. They're dropping more rain, and we're losing barrier islands and marshlands that used to act as important speed bumps for storm surge. Importantly, two of our strongest storms in state history, Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Ida, have occurred in just the last couple of years. So we're still recovering from those. But really beyond hurricanes, land loss and climate change just mean increased risks of flooding, both from high tides and intense rain events. Another issue is that Louisiana is a working coast. So we're not a coast that is characterized by white sand beaches and people laying in the sun. I mean, it's very much an industrial context. This includes folks that are working in fishing, ports and shipping, deep water oil and gas extraction, downstream petrochemical processing and transport. So for example, Louisiana coast produces about a quarter of the continental U.S. commercial fisheries landings, 20% of its waterborne commerce, and 90% of the country's outer continental shelf oil and gas. So in short, while this is something that's impacting the people of coastal Louisiana directly at present, it's really a problem of national significance. Last, I should mention that while a move to a low carbon economy is part of the answer to stemming the tide of climate change that's in part driving this issue, sort of a paradox is that the oil and gas industry is really vital in terms of employment in our region. And so we really need to think, and it's not only just that the petrochemical industrial complex is in the coastal zone, which it is, but also that oil and gas company pipeline canals have really contributed to the land loss. At the same time, because so many good jobs are located in that industry, we really need a thoughtful approach to dealing with the energy transition and reducing carbon emissions in a way that's going to center the well-being of working people in our state, rather than having people face dislocation. So in the final analysis, we have big policy questions around managing resilience, relocation, migration, and economic change amidst land loss.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was great. And I'm going to shift a little bit and reflect back on some of what we heard from Dr. Ken Johnson in the opening. We learned that for decades, many places in rural America have experienced outmigration, primarily as young adults have moved away, and the families and retirees that have been moving into a lot of these rural places haven't been enough to make up for the losses of young people. And so this has led to general population decline in many rural places that are kind of beyond that metro trend. Of the remote rural places with more natural amenities and outdoor recreational opportunities have been the exception to that pattern. Since the 1970s, these places have generally experienced more population growth than the rest of rural America. These are the western ski towns, the lake towns in the upper Midwest, the beach communities, all of those kinds of places, right? And since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, though, these patterns in both these kind of places have shifted. What we've seen is that migration has slowed down across rural America. So those places that were seeing more out-migration saw less out-migration as people stayed put. 87%, in fact, of all rural counties saw less out-migration during the pandemic than they had in the 3 years prior to the pandemic. And you can see this on the chart here. These data are from U.S. Postal Service change of address records. So these are administrative records that we've been working with at the monthly scale. So we've got monthly data. And you can see this out-migration decline has continued all the way up through June of 2020, at least is the most recent data that we've looked at. So all of those dashed lines there represent post-pandemic time period. At the same time, many of those recreation destinations that were already growing attracted more migrants than they had been prior to the pandemic. And this was especially true. This was especially true in the Intermountain West. So what you're seeing in this map in green here are all places that saw more positive, greater net migration during the pandemic than what they had been seeing in the years prior to the pandemic. In the red, in the oranges are places that saw less net migration during the pandemic than they had been prior. So you can see that almost all of the country is green here. Most of rural America saw more positive net migration, and a lot of that was primarily due to less out migration. In some places, it was also due to more in migration. Those few reddish orange places tend to be a lot of those places that were oil and gas producing places where those economies really slowed down during the pandemic, and a lot of workers who may have been there temporarily went back to where they came from. So at the same time, so we especially see this in the Intermountain West. And one of the things that we're seeing is that beyond just the recreation destinations that we've seen for a long time, seeing more in migration, we're seeing some expansion beyond the borders of those into their neighboring counties. And this is particularly true in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. You can advance to the next slide. So some of the places that have long time been recreation destinations, one example, Kootenai County, Idaho, where Coeur d'Alene is, seeing even more in migration. And now we're seeing the counties around it shifting from net out to net in during the pandemic, and some pretty dramatic net in. So the end result is that this is speeding up population growth in rural recreation destinations, and it's putting increasing demands on already scarce housing and other kinds of infrastructure, including water infrastructure, which we're going to hear more about from Tom. At the same time, it's bringing more people into the wildland-urban interface and coastal zones as well, where we have greater risk for natural disasters and some of the implications of climate change. So as Dr. Johnson said earlier, we don't know if this pattern is going to continue, but it seems to be, especially the decline in out migration, holding constant. Some of the increase in in-migration does appear to be slowing down as we've gotten further outside the pandemic. But some real hot spots.
Dr. Miller.
All right, so I'm going to talk and summarize some of my ongoing research on water infrastructure, access, and quality in rural America. So first, although we've made major gains in access and plumbing to in the United States, there's still a lot of work to be done. So the figure that's up here really shows trends in the percent of households without complete plumbing access at the county level. These county groups are separated by the degree of rurality, roughly, with the light blue groups being the most urban, and then the dark blue being the most rural. The takeaway here is that we made massive improvements in access to plumbing from 1940 to 2000, but then on the right, when we zoom in from 1990 to 2018, you can see it's more of a stalled story. And additionally, there's a very clear pattern where as rurality increases, access to plumbing is lower. This has resulted in a situation where relatively few households are impacted by this, generally less than 1%. However, at an absolute level, that still is over 486,000 households and as much as 2.6 million people, a population greater than the size of Houston, without access to plumbing in the US, and that's across rural and urban. And that doesn't include anyone experiencing homelessness. This estimate includes urban residents. So importantly, access to plumbing and clean water is not evenly spread across space or society. So the issue of water infrastructure and issues related to it are more common in rural areas, Alaska, Puerto Rico, the Southwest, Texas borderlands, and American Indian reservations. And on the social side, counties with a greater share of indigenous, poor, older, and less educated residents are more likely to have issues with plumbing access. Many rural water issues stem from an inability to afford infrastructural improvements in small community water systems. This reflects both a lack in resources and county priorities. However, investing in water infrastructure can pay dividends for rural counties. In some ongoing work we're doing, we find that when local governments increase their spending on water infrastructure, they see improved economic outcomes 8 years later. When looking from 1980 to 2015, increases in local government spending on water infrastructure were associated with decreases in poverty, increases in per capita income, and decreases in unemployment across all rural counties. Although, as I said, this took time to develop. However, just like access to plumbing, these benefits from water infrastructure investment are uneven. The economic returns to water investment are stronger as a county's share of non-Latino Black increases, and the returns become non-significant and in some cases actually negative as percent Latino and percent Indigenous. Thus, we find that the positive outcomes of rural water infrastructure are prone to longstanding patterns of systemic racism for some ethno-racial groups, but not others. Figuring out why that is. Finally, it must be stressed that even in rural areas with access to plumbing, water quality is often severely lacking. Many rural water systems are reaching the end of their life cycles in terms of when they were built, and they're in need of significant improvement and investment. These systems don't have the resources to go after federal or even state funding necessarily due to a lack of capacity and an inability to match funding when that mechanism is required. Further, a great number of rural Americans are on well water. Private wells, though, are entirely unregulated. They don't fall under the Safe Drinking Water Act. This means that we really have no idea on the quality of rural drinking water. There are some dated estimates from 2004 that found that 1 in 5 wells were contaminated at a level that would impact human health, so about 48%. Oh, sorry, and then 48% did not meet aesthetic standards. So maybe it wouldn't be bad for you, but you wouldn't want to drink it. So what do we need to do? We need a real household water monitoring program. There's a big gap between the water system and what comes out of a tap. If you think about lead in water or people on wells, and we need to make resources for rural water systems easy to access and not held behind administrative or funding or match-based burdens. And then finally, water policy and all policy, but water policy is what I'm talking about, needs to be sensitive and conscious of existing inequalities. Household water currently represents a notable environmental injustice along the lines of race, income, education, and morality. And the problem is most pronounced in areas well known for high levels of hardship, including reservation land, border colonias, rural South, and Appalachia.
Thanks everyone for your insightful and on-time lightning talks. I actually wanted to start with a question for you, Tom, but I think it's relevant to everyone if you also want to jump in after Tom. But how do you think the 2021 Infrastructure and Investment Act might impact the issues that you were discussing?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of looking recently to try and actually get a better sense of this, right? Because there's a lot in that bill, and a lot of it's fairly confusing. And so I think the answer is, if the question is, like, will the infrastructure bill matter for this issue? It's yes and no. So the National Rural Water Association, they were really enthusiastic about the bill passing. They've got a big thing up on their website. It's definitely going to help a lot of rural water systems. The bill generated new funds and supported existing funds. And in some cases, it kind of removed or reduced matching rules. And a number of the funds appear to have 100% forgiveness, even if they're classified as loans, at least on the principle of that loan. So it's going to help a lot of places, but it probably doesn't go far enough. There are concerns remaining on administration. The money is going to be funneled through the existing state revolving funds. These aren't new, and they're well known for being variously effective, right? And kind of variously easy or hard to access. An example that I found thinking about this is the bill now in Oklahoma. Oklahoma said that under this new bill, they're able to increase the loan forgiveness amount for communities in terms of water infrastructure from $250,000 to $1 million in terms of what they can forgive, or 25% of the total cost of the project. So if the cost of the project was, say, $500,000, you couldn't get it all forgiven, right? You could only get whatever 25% of that is. So that, unfortunately, it does still leave a lot of communities on the hook, right? Communities still have to come up with a significant amount of money. And as we were pointed out by Ken, right, and others, you have some natural decrease also leads to dwindling tax bases. And so you have water systems that and communities that maybe can't meet these matches. And then let me see anything else. So basically, also communities that have very low capacity are going to have difficulty going for these. The Bureau of Reclamation got a bunch of money, and they're saying that's going to all these rural people, but it's really just 6 projects. So again, water infrastructure is really expensive. And then there's also other spending, which is beyond the infrastructure bill, though there are other programs that are helping work through this. So there's the Water and Waste Disposal Loan and Grant Program, and that's been getting some more money under the Biden administration, and that focuses exclusively on places with populations of less than 10,000. In 2021, it gave out about $300 million. So there are things happening. People know it's an issue, but a lot of it's going through existing mechanisms and funds that are known for administrative hurdles. Continue to those issues.
Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the federal infrastructure bill is going to be really important. In general, federal transfers are important for our state. So, but on the specific issue that I talked about with the land loss, there's going to be a lot of money that's earmarked for roads and bridges, and obviously bridges help people get over that water. And we have real issues in the coastal area of major roads being submerged and getting washed out on a pretty routine basis. In fact, we have quite a number of small rural communities that routinely get cut off from the mainland water. So bridge building is going to be important. The other thing that will certainly invest money in our state is the resilience of the electric grid. As we've lost land and lost the kind of the speed bumps for the hurricanes, those hurricanes are coming on shore with more and more force than they used to. Most of our electric lines are above ground, and they're getting knocked over when those storms come in large numbers of people are getting cut off from electric. So doing some things to shore that up as well.
Rochelle, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the big thing is housing in a lot of these places. I mean, we have a housing crisis across our country, and it's particularly acute in some places more than others. And in particular, some of these places that we're already seeing growth and already had relatively high housing prices, lack of affordable housing, and seeing even increased pressure, and can't build it fast enough kind of opportunities, and then all the infrastructure demands that come along with that are really important. I think it'll be important in those ways.
Eddie, did you have a question from the audience?
There is an online question from Lori Hunter. And it is for Dr. Slack. Lori had visited Ile de St. Charles, Ile de John Charles, I apologize.
John.
You're gonna win, I'm not. She found it fascinating, but related to that, you briefly noted migration. Can you talk a bit about migration patterns and any sense of migration tension and perception of the concept of migration? Tough question.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, the example that she's raising with a community called Ile de Jean Charles, and my apologies to the Cajuns that are on the line, because I didn't do a very good job either. But this is an island off of Louisiana that was once a landmass of about 20,000 acres, and they're down to about 300 today. The island residents are primarily folks of indigenous ancestry. And they were able, between the state and the island residents, they were able to get a HUD block grant to do resettlement. This is an area that routinely getting, not only was the island shrinking, but they were routinely getting cut off from the mainland flooding. So they were able to get a HUD block grant with the state, and they're working on resettling some population households from the island to an area about 40 miles. So that's sort of an extreme example. But if you're interested, it's a really interesting case to look at. Really, I think more common is than sort of full community settlement is the more uncoordinated process of people just slowly leapfrogging inland from the coast, not completely moving away, in part because the land and the water are people are, the land and the water is kind of central to the identity for people on the coast. So it's more people kind of leapfrogging inland, or raising homes, right? Most of the homes in these areas are up on stilts, so 10 feet off the ground. So I think that's a more common story. In terms of intent, I mean, a little hard to say. I mean, our state has a long history of migration. That the only time in the last 50 to 60 years that we've had more people moving into Louisiana than moving out was in the 10 years following Hurricane Katrina, when we had people coming back after that storm. But we're really back to out migration at this point. So, are some of those people moving away in response to climate change and the threat of land loss and rising waters? Probably. But again, we've had this long history of out-migration. I think the bigger driver for most folks is economic opportunity.
Dr. Winkler. Since we're on migration, that's the next question. Do you have a sense of where folks are migrating from to high net in migration counties? Are they coming from other counties in the same state, bordering states?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the data that we've been looking at for this, we can't tell. We can't see where people come to and from. I can tell you that, there's been a lot of attention in the press, especially during the pandemic, about the idea of people fleeing urban areas or leaving the cities, some kind of exodus from cities. We see a lot less of that when we look at the data overall. There are a few major urban places that saw increased out-migration during the pandemic, especially in the first year or two, like in particular, New York and San Francisco stand out. But in terms of generally across the country, most of our cities did not see an increase in out-migration. In fact, most of them saw a decline in out-migration in the same kind of way the rural places did, but they saw a bigger decline in migration. And that's kind of the bigger story here, is like fewer people left rural America to move to the city. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. There weren't that same job pull that there often is, and there wasn't the same kind of cultural pull that there has historically been when things were all closed down. So it's been less in migration to urban areas than a fleeing of the cities, if you look at the data.
You have another question. This one is from Lori Hunter again. And it associates with Ken's comment. Ken was asked about second home. Do you have any insight on those kinds of patterns? Take it from there.
Yeah, so when we were looking at these data, the US Postal Service data allow you to file two different types of change of address forms. You can file a temporary one or a permanent one. We focused all of our research on the permanent ones only. I expect that we would capture a lot more with seasonal homes and people moving there for a couple of months, if we had looked at the temporary ones. But we wanted to instead really focus on what people might intend to be a permanent move. A lot of the same places that saw increased moving in were places that have a large proportion of seasonal housing units. And so I do think that's part of the story. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
So this is kind of for Tim, but for everybody, this issue of land loss is going to be a lot more widespread than just coastal Louisiana. And so my question is, has there been any analysis of the fiscal impacts of this? Not just loss of people, but loss of land, real estate, because a lot of fiscal resources, local fiscal resources come from real estate taxes. Is anybody looking at the implications of that for reduced local fiscal resources?
I don't know about that specifically. I would think and hope that somebody is working on that, but I don't know offhand. But it's, you know, the broader economic impacts are huge. I mean, the coast in many ways is where we live, it is lifeblood. You know, I mean, it's the fishing and the ports and the oil and gas that's drilled offshore, but processed onshore, that really drives much of the economy. In terms of the economic cost of property loss, you know, I haven't seen those numbers, but I do know that, you know, a major issue that's going on right now for us, and it's going to start happening in other places as well, is certainly at the household level, those losses are super real. Because people are either losing their homes, or the bigger issue that we're increasingly having is that the private insurance markets are failing. And so people can't insure their property. We're seeing really big uptakes in our state nonprofit insurer of last resort, because companies are either going bankrupt in our region, or they're pulling out of the market entirely. And so that's really leaving people in a lurch, because they can't, even if they wanted to move, they can't sell their properties. So they're really kind of stuck.
Just a quick follow-up. So you, in your talk, you said, well, Louisiana is not a bask in the sun kind of coast, but there are a lot of parts of the Gulf Coast that are. So I used to study snowbirds, and now I am a snowbird. I spend the winter in Sarasota, Florida, and a 2-foot increase in sea level will submerge all of those barrier islands on the Florida Gulf Coast, and none of those houses are on stilts. Everything is going to be. So I mean, this is a huge issue.
I might jump in here too and just think about this idea, something that I get asked a lot and in looking at these data is like how many of these migrants might be moving for climate change reasons. I think there's a lot of attention to this idea that we're going to have a growing number of immigrants or climate migrants. Seeing more of this in the press. And certainly that could be true. But I think the reality is that in the data, we don't see a lot of evidence of that going on in mass within this country. And even internationally, the data suggests that most people, even when faced with a natural disaster, prefer not to move or not move very far. And for all the same reasons that Tim was talking about, there are cultural reasons, there are family reasons, there are insurance reasons. There's a lot of factors that keep people in place. And what we're seeing in the data that I've been working with in particular is that even a lot of these places that are at greater risk of some of the impacts of climate change, like the coastal areas, like areas that are really prone to wildfires, for instance, we're seeing increased migration to those places. Rather than decreased on the net whole. And certainly there are individual stories and there are some people that are getting out of those places for climate reasons, but the overall net doesn't appear to be seeing very much of that as of yet.
I have a question. I think start with Tim, but maybe also Michelle. It's been a while since I've been to the southeastern coast of Louisiana, but I have been there and I didn't see any wind turbines. We now have this Inflation Reduction Act that has a lot of climate change money in it. Is there any chance that the coast of Louisiana is going to introduce some wind turbines in the Gulf Coast?
Yeah, I think.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is, do I think that we're gonna start to see wind turbines off the coast of Louisiana? the Gulf of Mexico? And the answer to that is yes, definitely. I mean, there's some political discussion around it. But I think that we'll definitely see that. And not only are we, in terms of environment, in a prime, spot to take advantage of that technology. But importantly, a lot of the skills of the working people are transferable, right? So the people that work offshore on the rigs and on the platforms, those very many of those same skills can be applied to the installation and operation of the wind technology. So that's I think if that transition happens in a managed way, and people are, that could be a good example of an opportunity to help to transition people economically rather than cause mass dislocation.
And then Paige.
Go ahead.
I've just got a follow-up question to that, which is, do you have any sense of the relative job availability of the offshore wind industry vis-a-vis oil and gas extraction industry as well?
Repeat the question.
So I need it repeated as well.
So oil and gas extraction is an ongoing process that requires significant ongoing employment. Is the installation and maintenance of offshore wind turbines have a similar level of employment demand for it? Or even if you saw significant investment in offshore wind turbines, is just the ongoing labor demand of that less, similar, or more than what you would lose if oil and gas were to decline?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question, I guess I would summarize is labor demand for the wind turbines or the windmills, is it going to be the same as what is demanded in the offshore oil fields? Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that specifically. I mean, what the information that I've seen is that there's some similar demands in terms of sort of fabrication, but not in terms of, I mean, on the oil rigs, you have teams of people that are out there for 14 days, 21 days at a time, and I don't know that that demand is the same.
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit. I mean, my knowledge is mostly about like inland turbine stuff, but the answer is no, right? I mean, basically, especially on the inland context, you see an initial blip of employment during setup and installation, and then it drops off. It doesn't really have much of a multiplier. And you can maintain turbines in more of a regional kind of model where you have people who drive around and maintain the turbines. And so because of that, it's not at least in the inland sense, it's not a big job creator. I don't see any reason why it would be more in terms of offshore, except for if we got into a period of prolonged development of lots and lots and lots of offshore, which then would have a longer tail on that initial development. The way that a lot of inland turbines work is a little bit, you can almost equate it to like a fracking pad, where you have, like some private land, and then there is either a lease, the land is bought, the turbine is built, and then basically the operator or whoever pays a fee to the landowner, right? And offshore that gets more complicated, but at the same time, it's unfortunately not a huge job creator in the way that oil and gas is. And that's one of the big issues broadly right now for rural America when we think about energy transition is what are jobs being replaced with? Because also jobs in natural amenity work also aren't incredible. They tend to be service sector work that doesn't pay very well. So.
And to add to that, the jobs can be very seasonal, and when you're thinking about oil and gas development, the booms and busts that happen in those sort of industries can often be really difficult for rural places to weather.
Yeah, so my question, I guess, builds off of my question about just transition, and we've been talking a little bit about job replacement, but I'm curious, in Louisiana, or I know you've done work on just transition as well, kind of what are the concerns outside of just, I guess, the jobs, specific to rural areas while we're transitioning and thinking about meeting cultural and social needs of the population that might be unique to rural population.
So I think I've been thinking a lot about this, just at a national level, so maybe I'll talk now. Yeah, but I think that, I think that, one of the big things that I've been struggling with is the idea that there's something to transition from in a lot of places. We're talking about, if you think about Ken's presentation, we have a lot of places that have been declining for a long time. We have a lot of places that have been in prolonged states of kind of hardship. So it's not necessarily that we're at this like awesome state and then we need to transition to stay there when we move to, say, less carbon intensive sectors. It's we have places that dropped off a while ago that we need to think about building back up. So I think that's a consideration that we don't often talk about. And then also, obviously, yeah, jobs are important, right? And I think that beyond jobs too, this idea of chronic outmigration and the idea of making sure that rural areas can be self-sustaining, and what does that look like? Like if you have dwindling tax bases, if you don't have young people and then you lose schools, I think that there's a lot of broader concerns that are all tied up in it. And then of course the just part of the just transition, that this all maps on top of our existing social and spatial inequalities, and people who are already at the bottom are going to continue to struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it's a difficult thing in the sense that in our region, oil and gas provides good jobs now. But there's also no doubt that oil and gas has played a pivotal role in helping to create the crisis. So, I mean, if you think about carbon emissions broadly, as well as just, in our region, it's the oil and gas companies that have cut up a lot of those wetlands, the pipeline and for canals and transport and that sort of thing. So there's direct responsibility there. And it's definitely true as well that they don't build refineries and chemical plants next to gated communities, right? So there's real big environmental justice issues there. I mean, our petrochemical industry really travels along the river, and is located disproportionately next to communities that are low income and African American. So there's a lot. I guess there's a lot to be said about that issue for sure. I mean, there's tons of environmental justice questions.
And I could speak briefly on this too. I think when we think about just transition and energy transition, we also have to think about energy costs, which there are a lot of rural places that pay disproportionately high rates for energy costs, and potential changes for those implications. So that's also a justice issue that we have to think about when we think about rural America. And then, thinking about siting of renewable energy is that's the biggest challenge right now to developing more renewable energy is all of the siting challenges in a lot of rural communities that are the potential home of new installations that are fighting it, many of them, for a variety of reasons. Some of the real concerns out there, I think, though, are questions about lost agricultural lands, questions about just rural autonomy and having a say in the decision-making process, questions about the distribution of the costs and benefits. There are a lot of places where energy costs are high that they're asked to site facilities and they're not getting the power and it doesn't impact their utility, their local electric at all. And questions about public access being taken away for industrial development is the way a lot of people see it.
And I guess just building on that too, I think that the directly related to that is there are a lot, I mean, the oil and gas companies that contributed to creating kind of the crisis, right? They're operating under a very kind of capitalist logic of making money, right? That's also how renewable energy is being developed, right? And so you have to remember that, like, there's been some really good work, particularly on like Oaxaca and Mexico, that basically argued that wind energy in Mexico pursued the extractive model. They just did the same playbook in how they bought up land, how they put in development. And you're seeing the same thing. I think there's been a lot of resistance. People in New York would know better than me, but I think there's been issues with large scale solar in upstate New York related to this. And so I think that that's the other thing too, is remembering that like the green energy companies are still companies. They're still going to operate like companies, and justice concerns don't go away just because it's better for the environment. And you see that we've done some work looking at where wind energy is sited, and it is patterned atop existing social dimensions that we know for EJ, or environmental justice. Obviously, it's not quite as harmful to be next to a turbine, right? That's undeniable, but it still is a burden that some have to bear and others don't. And then when you get into, I think solar has more issues related to farmland loss and public access and water issues as well in terms of runoff.
I'd like to put a finer point on something that Tim was asked before, and then this conversation. I think one of the best indicators of the sort of old story is new story, or new story is old story with renewable energy and capitalism, is that we really sell this green energy to investors based on how we can lower the labor costs in the long term. So even though we don't necessarily have drone technology that does all of the monitoring of wind turbines now, we sell this to investors as something that's coming down the road that will lower labor costs more. We sell solar projects using that same logic. We say this is a great long-term investment in 30 years, and we'll need fewer and fewer people to run these in the future. And so we're actually seeing these issues sort of coalesce in the way we sell the renewable energy as an investment. We're seeing labor being literally, removed sort of explicitly from the equation.
I think one solution that we've seen to this is like models that are more community owned models, community solar, community wind programs like that tend to be very popular.
There's a great book that came out last year by Stephanie Malin and Megan Coleman called Building Something Better. And it has some great examples of particularly Native communities that have, taken some of their own energy needs in their own hands by building their own solar farms and that sort of thing. And so if you're looking for some examples of some positive energy development, it's a really good book to read that has some of those case studies.
Sean wrote an excellent book.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm going to take some of these questions out of order because of where we're going with this discussion. Daniel Rubart says it doesn't sound like climate change is deterring some migration patterns. I'll allow Michelle's comments. She's wondering if perceptions about environmental health might have the potential to impact migration. Specifically thinking about recent research showing elevated risk of everything for infants within 2 kilometers of natural gas wells. Any thoughts? And Chris Dyers asked a question about the co-op model for renewable energy. You might be interested. Take any part of those 2 questions.
Well, I think that co-op model for renewable energy question is, I think we do see increasing attention to that. This is like a community solar co-op model. It's really working in a lot of states. There's more, it's a real growth industry, and most communities are excited to host community projects, as opposed to a lot of the resistance that we see when communities are approached to host traditional utility scale projects.
I
But
would
there are some
imagine,
state policy differences. Sorry to jump in on that. That's one of the things we're facing in Michigan right now. We don't have community solar enabling policy, something that's been proposed, but hasn't been taken up. And so utilities don't do it. They don't have to do it, and it's not in their best interest to do it. So it's not allowed to happen.
Let me qualify something. I was reading the word all as in all. It instead stands for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which if you're nodding your head, you answer the question. Dr.
oh, yeah, it's a condition. I think that, I mean, I would have to, I don't know. I don't know about environmental health and how it determines migration, but I would have to imagine, I mean, people don't like just anecdotally, when you talk to people who move, right, people are afraid of so everybody has a risk tolerance that's different, right, for certain kinds of things. Like people in Oklahoma don't think twice about tornadoes and massive hailstorms, right? And they're terrified of the idea of a hurricane, right? And so that's like large events. But then I do think that if people actually know about the proximity of natural gas stuff, when they're choosing to buy a house, if it's disclosed, I would have to imagine it impacts their choice. But I don't know if it would. I don't know how that information flows. I think that would be very key to that. Is are people told these things disclosed, et cetera. But I don't. It's a bit outside.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact answer to that question either. I mean, what I would say is that in areas of our state where we have a long history of petrochemical manufacturing, that's a threat that people live with every day. And so there is, I don't know if acclimated is the right word, but I mean, people get sort of used to knowing that that's part of life. And I don't know how many people flee it. I mean, we've had some disasters, some technological disasters in our region. People pay a lot of attention to, like the 2010 Deepwater Horizon spill. But we have smaller spills pieces all the time. All the time. I mean, there was a big, just about a month ago, we had in West Baton Rouge, we had a big chlorine leak, and that happens in that industry. And people just shut their windows.
Got one more, and it's really for the whole group. This one is from Ethan Walton, who asked, and it somewhat changes the topic. Because there's been a lot of discussion of a decline in out-migration during the pandemic. What are some incentives that could be put in place to encourage more younger people to remain in rural areas? Kind of the broad, multi-million-dollar question. Take it away, T.
I think it's a great question. I think, I mean, this is one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in doing this work is, I think the decline in out-migration represents a real opportunity for a lot of rural places that are trying to stem that tide. Even keeping people around for a couple more years represents a real gain. And some of the ways that we can keep more people in place is getting, ability to have rewarding, well-paying jobs is important. But there are other things that are important as well. Getting people involved, and even young people involved in the life of the community as valued members that have a say. And in rural places, as we see more and more aging, a lot of the leaders in rural places are worn really thin and aging out, and we need more young people brought into those leadership roles and having a say in places, and that kind of commitment to place. Also, somebody asked earlier about broadband is super important. Having the ability to access the internet for a decently cheap price with high speeds. Investments in outdoor recreation we see works as well. So, it's not like you're going to build yourself a mountain or a beach, but you can build recreational trails, and you can have parks, and you can have access, and you can have farmers markets is another thing we know attracts young people. So some of those investments in place that build that kind of an amenity and recreation lifestyle for people can help.
oddly enough, I recently finished a book project, and the end of it is this question. And basically what I came down to in terms of trying to like save and encourage rural places in the US to continue is like a soft path and a hard path. And the soft path for me was things like kind of what you're saying. So incentivizing people to move there, things like student loan forgiveness, I think, basically trying to create the ability for people to stay. Because that's the thing, is there are people who want to live in rural places that can't, right? And I boiled it down, and to me, it's basically this crux that we have, which is that people are free to move where they want, but they really can only move where they can find employment. And so then at the hard path end, what I came down to as well is something like a universal basic income, or so, basically like the stronger safety net to allow people to live where they want. So to me, that's how I kind of started to think about it, is that long run, because of the transitions we're seeing away from kind of internal peripheries in the US where we have extractive activities occurring and kind of these carbon intensive activities, because we're seeing less of that, there's fewer jobs in rural areas, and there's not going to be more necessarily unless we can get people to be able to stay there and start experimenting and tinkering, et cetera. And another part of that in the soft path that I had in my head was broadband and really allowing remote work to continue to thrive in rural places. Because in Utah, at least, I remember talking to people there. They said, well, we were told we have high-speed internet, but we can't even stream Netflix. So I don't really believe it. So I think that's one of the other issues, is that how we define high-speed internet isn't always what it actually is.
I mean, I think y'all did an excellent job answering that. I mean, it seems to me that just, anything that can allow people to fully utilize technologies that are reducing the opportunity cost of space. Really helpful.
And I think that one thing that wasn't brought up that I think is also important if you want young families is thinking about quality of schools, childcare, and those are big problems in a lot of rural.
Especially right now, childcare, crisis situation in many rural places, really important.
So I think one part of this reduced out migration has to do with aging in place. And so the work we did a decade ago now, so maybe things are different, is that very few communities were really planning for aging in place of their older population, both people who were recent in movers at a relatively older age, people who are long-term residents. And it is expensive to have extremely old people, and it requires a lot of programs, soft and hard infrastructure to accommodate the needs of an extremely aging population. So I think that's really an important aspect of community, how community demographics come together.
I know we have one more question in the back. And then
Yeah, I was
stop.
wondering, so panelists talk about rural development problems like land use, the losing population, and also the water quality infrastructure. So I was wondering if you could number maybe one or two policies at state or federal level that could help your communities address those challenges.
So the question was, is there a policy that could help rural places address some of the challenges that you all discussed? So anybody want to take that one?
I guess my pet policy on that would be things like larger student loan forgiveness to allow young people to move back home if they want and not have to worry quite as much about that looming over their head. And then similarly, of course, like some sort of stronger safety net, whether that's universal basic income but something to basically allow people to have more flexibility in making decisions where they're going. I think will help a lot of those places, particularly young people, right? So those are my two pet ones. I think there's a lot of policy.
Isn't a real issue the way in which monies from these new federal programs are allocated, because a lot of this comes through block grants, and then the issue is really not the federal and the state, it's really the state and the local. And that's where I think a lot of these environmental, the justice issues come in. Who's getting those monies that come to the state? What areas and what population groups?
I'm not a fan of block grants for that reason.
All right, thanks, everyone. This has been a really great, lively session. Take 3 or 4 minutes as we transition to the next. All right, thank you to those who allowed us to have a small break here, in Washington DC. So I'm Sean Golding again, and I'm sitting here with Dr. Paige Kelly of Ohio State University, who's a postdoctoral fellow, and we'll talk about services and at the county level in the US. John Green, who is the director of the Southern Rural Development Center. We'll talk about rural broadband and continue some of the conversation that was started in our last session. And Daniel Lichter, who is professor emeritus from Cornell University, who will talk about the population increases that are coming to some rural areas due to Hispanic migration. So without further ado, we'll get started. I think
Yeah, so thank you. So the focus of my presentation will be on findings from a 2019 national survey of county governments, where we really looked at rural-urban variation and key factors important to improving local economic prosperity and population well-being. And specifically, we were focused on how rural governmental capacity influences their ability to address community needs. So in this survey, we explored some measures of administrative capacity. So in this figure here, we compare across 3 measures of rural urban, so metro, non-metro adjacent, and then remote rural or non-metro, non-adjacent counties. And so we note that non-metro rural counties are less likely to have on-staff planners, grant writers, economic development professionals on staff. And then even on a more basic level, we see that non-metro rural counties are also less likely to have a website for residents to find information about the government and the services it provides. And then looking at some of the challenges that local governments face that cause fiscal stress, we asked in the past 3 years how important had the following problems been for your county government's finances. And we see again across all areas, rural counties continue to be under greater fiscal pressures with declining federal and state revenue, declining tax bases, citizen pressure to reduce taxes, all being more likely to be reported as very important sources of fiscal stress among rural governments relative to their metro urban peers. And then next we asked about location-related challenges for local government. And these barriers included things such as labor force quality, such as a lack of skilled labor, inadequate infrastructure, including telecommunications, roads, water, sewer, etc., lack of major employers, quality of public schools, cost and availability of land, and then political opposition. And overall, non-metro counties reported a greater number of barriers. So while non-metro adjacent counties are potentially poised for growth, relative to metro counties, they fall short on some of the needed ingredients and are more likely to report inadequate telecommunication and a lack of capital and funding. And then at the same time, they suffer some of the same limitations as more remote rural counties, such as fewer local employers. Yet it should be stressed that remote rural counties face some of the most intractable barriers, with nearly half reporting population loss as a barrier to economic development. So just in conclusion, we see some important implications for rural areas from this research. So first, due to their greater capacity, larger urban county governments will be better able than their rural peers to protect their poor residents and citizens at large, as well as to pursue new opportunities for economic development and growth. Meanwhile, rural areas will continue to be left with minimalist governments, which risks reinforcing historical patterns of spatial inequality.
thanks, Paige. Next up is John.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to be speaking about rural broadband and digital access issues, and really drawing from work beyond myself with the National Digital Education Extension Team, or ND for short, especially our research subcommittee. And as was highlighted in the previous talk, access to and use of broadband internet service with broadband capable devices has become a major pathway by which people communicate with each other, obtain information and services, and complete a wide range of transactions. This has transformed not only individual and family life, but also the institutions of education, business, and government. Advances in broadband technology have impacted what people need to participate and thrive in economic life, and this has influenced what they expect to be able to do from the communities where they live. Because of this, digital access is of critical importance to rural community vitality, as we've already heard. While the shifts were already well underway at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, this experience has demonstrated the promises of broadband utilization, as well as the perils of its absence. Although there's a great deal of variation across types of spaces, rural or non-metropolitan areas have tended to lag behind their urban counterparts in broadband infrastructure, availability of high-quality services, and adoption of broadband. Looking at just one of the possible indicators, as is shown in this map, is the broadband subscription rate reported through the American Community Survey. There are general differences between metropolitan and non-metropolitan rates, but also wide variations in the low 30s to high 90s in the percent of households with broadband subscription rates in the 2025 year data. Further, we see clustering of subscriptions both in terms of highs and lows. Now, areas that have made broadband more accessible have become particularly attractive to people being able to work remotely and thus having greater choices about where to live. Although climate, weather, natural amenities, housing availability and affordability, healthcare access, and educational quality are all important, again, as we've already been discussing this morning, we know that employment opportunities are essential to influencing where people can reside. Individuals and their businesses cannot connect remotely without adequate broadband services. Now, the causal arrows likely point both ways. Places with adequate broadband attract people to remain or move in, and places with momentum of in-migration are more attractive to providers to improve access and to compete for customers. Research attention is increasingly focused on these issues. To help stimulate holistic thinking around issues of digital access to inform programming and policy, the framework developed by NDEEP might be instructive, as is demonstrated in this next title, in this next figure. We're looking at digital access as a continuum, with each of the parts being essential for the ultimate use of broadband for personal, community, and societal advancement. These include people being aware, having the services available and accessible to them, and choosing to adopt broadband. For each of these parts, there are roles that can be played by development organizations. The nation's 4 regional rural development centers, with funding from USDA, NIFA, and the Extension Foundation, recently conducted a national assessment of rural development priorities from the perspective of stakeholders working through land-grant universities and extension service, other colleges and universities, nonprofits, and local government. This work included a survey on a range of topics where broadband was mentioned as an asset, challenge, and opportunity in relation to infrastructure services, workforce development, economic development, and health, followed by a series of regional and national virtual listening sessions. One of those meetings focused on broadband. The priorities coming out of those discussions warrant attention and are highlighted, as you see in this figure, about the roles of development organizations to address these issues. To conclude, I want to underscore the importance of digital access for rural community vitality. In the context of both the pandemic and unprecedented investments in expansion of broadband infrastructure, let us also consider and plan for adoption and digital literacy to use those technologies to improve quality of life in a more equitable fashion.
Thanks, Sean. I guess what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to build on some of the work that Ken and I have done. Ken talked about some of it earlier this morning about these 2 master trends that seem to be working at cross purposes. These 2 master trends in rural America, one of which Ken outlined as being this history of rural America in a period of demographic decline, a period of depopulation, and then for the first time in U.S. demographic history, the last decade, as absolute population decline for many rural areas. The other master trend, of course, that Ken talked about briefly, was this trend of large numbers of Hispanics moving into rural communities, where for the first time ever, all of the rural growth was the result of Hispanic population increase and other racial and ethnic minorities, the way population declined, absolutely. So what I want to do today is I want to focus on this last 10-year period and talk a little bit about those two issues. And the question that I really want to pose, and Ken and I have done some work on this, is whether Hispanics and other immigrant groups, refugee populations, so on, can provide kind of an economic lifeline to rural America. Can they offset depopulation and aggregate population decline in many rural areas? When you look at Latinos in particular, you could characterize their redistribution patterns as a pattern of dispersed concentration. That is, Hispanics are moving everywhere, but they're also concentrating in those places everywhere. And they're working in meatpacking plants, the hospitality industry, and high amenity and recreational areas. They're working in dairy industries, they're working in the vineyards, they're working in aquaculture, and on it goes. And they're changing those communities in big ways. So you can think about economic development being affected by new immigration in those destination communities, those new destinations. But you might also think about Hispanic growth occurring in areas that are already growing, in which case they're not offsetting or affecting this massive depopulation that we've seen over the last century, and especially over the last decade. So that's what I'm going to focus on today and see where that's going. So this is just an initial chart that looks at the 2010 to 2019 period. The left-hand set of columns over there, the first three columns there, you've got total population change, that's the blue there, and you can see on average in areas that didn't have an Hispanic presence, they declined on average by about 6,000 people per year. And all that decline was generated by declines in the non-Hispanic, mostly white population, but also African Americans as well. Hispanics are growing in those particular areas. So white decline is responsible for this declining population overall in these rural areas. And as I'll show you in a bit, it's been really dramatic. If you look on the other hand, where Hispanics are really growing, we characterize three different kinds of counties where Hispanics have played a big role. One are what I would call an emerging new destinations. These are areas that are growing now more recently and becoming new Hispanic immigration hotspots with mostly Hispanic first and second generation. New destinations started primarily in the 1980s and 90s. Lots of growth. These are a lot of growth associated with meatpacking plants. And then the last part is we're mostly talking established gateway communities. We're talking primarily about areas in the Southwest along the Lower Rio Grande Valley and so on. There's a traditional settlement. But in each case, you can see Hispanic growth there. And in each case, you can see that the declines have been much, much lower among the non-white population and growth overall than what we see for rural areas overall, especially those that don't have a large Hispanic population. Let's go to the next slide. Now, of course, that is growth in the aggregate. We can also look at growth across different kinds of counties. Here are I think the same typology that Ken used earlier, but across the top, we've got population loss counties that are experiencing loss both of Hispanics and non-Hispanics. And then we've got the next two there, the second and third columns are population loss and Hispanic gain, meaning that these areas are losing population, but it's being offset at least partly by Hispanic population growth. And then we've got counties that experience population growth, but they only grew because Hispanics were moving into those communities and offsetting the decline among non-Hispanics. And then lastly is we've got population gain overall. I think one of the things that's most dramatic here is you can see here that in areas that, very few of these areas, you look at the very bottom for the total, you can see only 3.4% experienced population loss and Hispanic loss overall. I think the big pattern here, the modal pattern over the last decade, has been the second column there at the very bottom in green. About 64% of counties experienced Hispanic gain, but still overall population loss. So they haven't been able to offset the decline of whites, basically. And that's quite a high figure compared to the past. And then about 10%, 9.8% experienced Hispanic population gains that more than offset the non-Hispanic declines. And that's about 200 counties. So we're talking about widespread impacts of Hispanics and widespread impact on overall growth. And the successful counties seem to be those that are experiencing population increases of Hispanics. In the last one, population gains, we're talking about 22%, 23% experience gains in the absence of these other factors. So let me just say what the bottom line here is a bit. It's pretty clear that America's burgeoning Latino population is really become the demographic lifeblood of rural America, and it's broadly experienced across many different parts of America. And those counties that aren't experiencing Hispanic growth are experiencing very rapid population decline. And it's likely that's going to continue into the future. I want to just draw like three main implications. So what does this mean for public policy? I think one thing is that Hispanic growth can help revitalize dying communities, but it also at the same time suggests a kind of new macro level segregation where perhaps like the past where we've seen Blacks, especially in cities, becoming part of a urban underclass, we might think of these rural Hispanic communities as now being isolated in rural America where no one actually goes there except for those populations, much like we see in the Delta with African American. The second point I want to make here is for many rural residents, this will be the first time in these Hispanic communities where whites primarily, and maybe African Americans for that matter in the South, have been exposed to a different population culture. And so this upends traditional institutional arrangements in the community, power structures, and so on, that is going to be something that these communities are going to have to deal with. And then lastly, I just want to mention just a little bit about what's going on around the globe, and that is that there's a movement towards seeing providing heartland visas in Australia, other parts of Europe, to provide visas that allow people to have access to visas if they agree to settle in rural areas. And we've seen this with refugee populations too, where some communities are bringing in a different refugee population for the purpose of rebuilding their communities. The Aspen Institute, for example, if you're interested in this topic, have been very much interested in how local business communities, business leaders and local politicians are using this as an issue to grow their communities. The problem is sometimes there's a difference between the interests of the local folks who are initiating these activities, trying to grow the community, and those people who are doing the work and have been traditional parts of the community. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thanks everyone. So we've just learned about three essential pillars of rural economic vitality. Most rural places need people to move there to work and fill schools and utilize hospitals. They need connectivity and integration with modern information networks, and not just for economic access, but also to access basic social services. And lastly, rural communities need the governmental capacity to maintain the infrastructure that sustains those two other pillars. So these issues, I think we often understand as being distinct economic problems, but they're obviously very interrelated, if not interdependent. So my first question is for Dan. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's bringing the Latino population to rural.
Yeah, I think a lot of it started really in the late 1980s. There's sort of you think about California's proposition where they were making it difficult for Hispanics to live there. There's been a militarization of the border. People have moved up to the midsection of America in part because of what's happening in traditional Asian areas. So that's one thing. But there's also been a demand for the labor in those, especially in the meatpacking industry, it's probably most visible. The example I always give is Worthington, Minnesota, because Worthington was maybe 3 to 5% Hispanic in 1990. Today, it's a majority minority community. Maybe 40% is Hispanic, but it gets over the 50% number with refugee populations of all sorts from Southeast Asia and the like. And the community has completely been transformed as a result of that. So meatpacking is certainly one, but we see it in upstate New York in the dairy industry, working in the apple orchards, working in the vineyards around Cornell, the same sort of issue. So I think a lot of it is job related, but it also is related to the incentives to move more generally, but also to the urge to leave parts of areas in the west and the southwest that have been experiencing a lot of anti-immigrant stuff. We saw that in Arizona too, of course.
So my next question is for John. So you talked about the geographic concentration of broadband subscription. What can you say about income differences in broadband subscriptions and how those vary across states?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, part of access that we should always be concerned about is not just is the service there, you know, accessible physically in terms of the infrastructure, but also in terms of affordability. And we know that this is an elective service, and in places where you don't have great infrastructure, it can be even more expensive. In terms of the, you know, obviously there's a lack of really good data at that scale, but certainly what we see from the American Community Survey is pretty wide variation, you know, comparing household income groups that, you know, just for example, if we look overall at the nation as a whole, for those households with less than 20,000 people, we see the median is about 56% of those households have broadband, compared to about 93% of households with incomes over 100,000. What's interesting is that kind of pattern, that level of difference, say about a 30% difference, holds across rural and urban areas. But what we see through some other research, we've recently done a survey working with the historically Black land-grant colleges with the 1890 system, and working in collaboration with Purdue, did a survey of people about who did have broadband. What were some of the challenges? You know, you've got a lot of people who are only using their phone for access, tend to be lower income. You know, those sort of challenges. And what we see is in rural areas, the issue of affordability combined with quality access intersecting. Right? Is that not only is it going to cost me a lot, but is it going to cost me a lot and still not be able to do things? That's a big challenge. And so I think actually this is one of those places where, given the inequalities, really bring rural and urban kind of organizations, constituencies, governments together, maybe in some ways that we haven't seen, where kind of digital equity is important to all of us.
I think that's such an interesting economic phenomenon that you could be rural, be paying more, and getting less out of your internet. Paige, do you see correlations in your work, or perhaps a causal link between service provision?
No causal links.
Between service provision and population growth?
Well, I mean, as you know, one of the things I'm speaking to Tom's point earlier about water access, like having access to water and sewer is the precedent for being able to build new housing. And so having, you know, the resources to actually set up for growth. Otherwise, you're going to end up, I mean, with a lot of well water, and that's not necessarily what everyone wants. So I think, you know, access to capital, access to resources, yes, there's a lot that kind of intersects with the ability to grow or to meet growth when it starts happening. So.
Can I connect to that, Sean? Just thinking about this connection with, as we were discussing water, I'm coming from Mississippi, we're going through a water crisis that transcends rural urban areas. I think, you know, related to this discussion of population change and local government capacity, and as it relates to services, also how do you weather this challenge of population loss, right? How do you adapt to a new population level is that may be lower, but that the water system needs, the road system needs, and the school building needs all remain. So how you do that is largely a question of local government capacity. I think it's just an essential topic for us to discuss.
And
Yeah, well, it struck me, thinking about what Danielle presented in local government capacity, that, you shared some pretty big differences and low levels of capacity in non-metropolitan America for grant writing and planning in particular. And then I'm thinking about how so many of our state and federal resources are distributed through, you have to write a grant in order to be even to access any of the programs that are out there, and how limited that makes rural communities' ability to tap into resources that are out there, presumably for everyone. And so do you imagine that these inequities just get replicated through those kinds of systems? And do you have any ideas for how we might do better?
Yeah.
Particularly given what John was pointing out, that, as tax bases are reduced, there's less and less ability for rural communities to hire a grant writer or a plan.
Yeah, great question. We see some of the difference in just the recent federal policy. So the American Rescue Plan gave direct funds to local government and was transferred from the Treasury, and there weren't the administrative burden of applying. There's still some concern about, reporting and stuff, but that's obviously different than having to go through the block grant application and be those competitive grant basis. And so, and then we see with the return of that with the infrastructure bill. And I think in some ways the infrastructure bill, and Tom spoke to this as well, is going to replicate those inequities across places in terms of the capacity they have to apply, also just the knowledge of how to navigate those systems. Because we're talking, when we talk about county governments, we talk about governments that have a couple 100,000 employees relative to some that have maybe 5 part-time staff or 1. Yes. And so, those just the administrative capacity, that's the thing about the survey, is being able to capture some of those, the quality of it outside of just numbers, because we can get numbers from census governments, but what are they actually doing matters as well. So in terms of federal policy, I think those, thinking about how we structure the fund, that they aren't just replicating those differences matters a lot. And now I'm forgetting the second part of the question. Yeah. Oh,
Go ahead. I think you answered.
okay.
There's an online question from Carrie Art that's related. Have you examined if and how capacity varied by racial and ethnic characteristics?
So some of my research has been looking at also, so if communities even have the capacity, whether or not they provide services. And big surprise is usually that they provide services in areas where white poverty is higher, but are non-responsive to need among Black and Hispanic populations. And so linking to Dan's research, there's also concern that, even as these, they might be a lifeline, but what is the quality of life for Hispanic migrants to these communities? Are they facing discrimination from local governments and needing their service needs? And
Could I just add to that?
Yeah.
If you look at the evidence, welfare receipt of all sorts is way lower in these destinations for Hispanics, even when they're eligible. And then if you look at the poverty rates of newborns in some of these new destinations, we're talking about poverty rates for newborn Hispanic kids that are almost. So they're at a disadvantaged population.
Yeah, and I think when we think about, is this a lifeline?
Some people are having trouble here.
Oh, yeah. And so we're talking about, populations of Hispanics as a lifeline for rural America, great for the kind of zeitgeist of rural America, but what is the actual quality of life for these populations? And if governments aren't even responsive to the needs that they have relative to their white peers, that's not, very promising for long-term viability, I think, in terms of actual human flourishing in these areas.
So I want to ask a question about broadband. And I think somebody said that broadband is seen as an discretionary service, but it's really not. It's a utility. It's essential for living, working, learning, socializing in urban or rural areas. So then the question is, how do you measure access? And so, does a community have it or not? Broadband, high-speed broadband? Yes, no. Okay, let's say yes. What percentage of households have access? Yes, no. That's where we are now. But that's not, in my opinion, I don't think that's enough. So then you go within the household. What is the, how many computers or tablets or whatever are available per household that has any access at all? So is there any data that drills down to that micro level? Because during the pandemic, you've got households with 3 and 4 and 5 people, competing for the same device to work, to go to school, whatever. So are there any data sets that would give you that granular data on actual access at the person level?
Yeah, not all from one source, which is the challenge. But for example, with the American Community Survey, we can sort out the data by whether or not people have a computer, as well as their broadband, as well as the source of broadband, as well as dial-up, satellite, et cetera. The challenge of connecting that with whether or not there's actually broadband services widely available, that comes from a different source, which we know has a lot of data limitations. There's now the APLU system where people can do tests and then upload that into a database. I actually have a group of researchers, Roberto Gallardo from Purdue, Brian Whitaker from Oklahoma State, that have connected that with census block data and looking at what they're calling, your term, granular look at what speeds do we have different forms of broadband. The next step, which hasn't happened yet, is then how do we connect that with the survey data to see what types of devices people are using
Within household.
within households. Yeah. But everything points to the challenge that you identify is that it's not just it's all of these together that make it digital access, combined with then the issue of digital literacy, which we don't have good data on.
So this is just following up on that. So I've lived places where I have great LTE coverage and from the internet and vice versa. And so I was just wondering, with the data that you're using, and maybe you talked about this and I just missed it, but how are things like LTE coverage, treated? Because there's a lot of people who, have unlimited data and their phone or iPad, right, is their computer essentially. So they don't even have a laptop, right? So internet is less the issue so much as it's cell phone coverage at that point, LTE or 5G coverage. Does the data account for that at all, or are we just talking like classic Wi-Fi?
It doesn't account for it great. I mean, there's additional observational data around issues of cell coverage. What we do know from some of the survey data is people can report if they only use their cell phone, which is kind of an indicator, but of course is a real challenge for all these other applications in terms of school or work, if it's relying solely on cell phone. That I would say is a data gap on the intersection of those two.
I'm gonna go back to race and ethnicity. This question actually came from Lori Hunter for Dan. You mentioned macro segregation at the end. And that's really interesting and important. Working with county data, but do you have any sense of spatial segregation of Hispanic and non-Hispanic populations within?
Yes, I do.
And yes, got it. Okay,
So,
elaborate.
so with my colleague, Timo Breezy, state, we've done a lot of work on residential segregation within rural counties. We focused on segregation within municipalities in a county, but also segregation outside those municipalities, and also to the extent to which they're related to something. You can imagine Hispanics concentrating in a place like Worthington, Minnesota, which has gone to majority minority, and the white population is actually declining. Well, where they're going? They're going into the outlying rural areas of the county. And some of the most segregated areas in the United States, both in rural and urban areas, occur in areas in the rural, more dispersed settlement areas of counties. Those are either very white, or they're very black, or some other racial mix. So yes, we've done some of that work. I'd be happy to send Lori some papers.
That's a good point. Don't forget, you can always email various people and ask questions. Rural communities and agricultural producers face unique stressors. This is from Catherine McGuire. Cultural competency in providing health services has lagged behind. Any thoughts on how to address the health workforce shortages and shortages of health providers? Especially those trained to provide diverse values to leaders, but shortage.
You know, can I just add one thing about, because this gets right back to the broadband.
It does.
Telemedicine, law, you know, this, a lot of stuff in the pandemic really put all this stuff on display.
Okay,
Your stuff is really relevant.
the question was asked to be repeated, the volume. It was, how do you address the healthcare workforce issues that are getting more and more serious? And with a special emphasis on doing so in a way that's culturally sensitive. And appropriate. And we're still answering.
I think there's different types of healthcare. So we have aging rural populations that require very different healthcare services and like care support. We have children who need, there's a lot of care that happens at various points in the life stage. And so, you know, day to day, maybe going to a general practitioner can happen over telehealth, but treatments and things are also still a barrier. And this just comes down again to, well, I'm like, make my pitch, which is for federal investment in care sector, and whether that actually making those jobs like a livable wage and desirable to have in those areas, so that, you know, we're addressing the general lack of care infrastructure across the country, but specifically in the rural areas as well.
Yeah, and I would add to it. I mean, we have a great model that was started in rural America. I mentioned that it was started in Mississippi Delta, in the federally qualified community health center system. Now we have thousands of community health centers around the country, and so there's an avenue for being able to expand care, coupled with how do we connect that with preparation of the rural healthcare workforce. And so, you know, I think there's some really innovative models. The question is, how do we expand that as it relates to kind of culturally competent care? I'll give an example. Meharry Medical School has a partnership with Aaron Henry Community Health Center in Clarksdale, Mississippi, serves multiple counties. And they have their medical students come and do their service there. It kind of transforms what they're exposed to. So we've got this great model, we've got this great potential, but I think the challenge comes back to the earlier discussion. Almost all of that is grant funding. And so how do we, I mean, you know, for example, community health centers get a certain amount of base funding and in no way meets their needs, let alone what they could do with expanded services. And you've got the leaders of the health centers, right, who are supposed to be providing care, also having direct net. It becomes a real challenge.
And I would say we're also seeing this crisis that in some ways is brought about by increasing opportunities in telehealth, that rural hospitals can't necessarily recruit specific things like radiologists because radiologists can now work from home and get the best contract and do their job completely remotely. So there are, I think, unique sort of intersections of different issues here that are impacting health. And Rochelle and I were just talking about this yesterday, we both live in rural places that are really struggling across the board to get nurses. And we think about nurses, but it's also radiologists, it's nurse practitioners, a lot of specialties that are not there.
So when this question came up, I immediately Googled rural hospital closures. And there's a whole page here, and you know, Kansas is number 7 in the most rural hospital closures. That's the headline here. Since my point here is, I'm not sure that hospitals are the best way to deliver medical care in rural areas. And why should we reproduce a system that might not have been that appropriate for low density populations anyway? So what are some alternatives to the traditional hospital for producing good access to primary medical care in the rural areas? Any ideas?
We are seeing a slow transition to new models or redefinitions about what a hospital is. I think I was just listening to NPR and heard about, you know, a hospital that essentially became a really good urgent care. So it's not where you would go to repair a major problem, but it is where you would go if you have an emergency and stabilize you, prepare you to get transported by helicopter. So there is a need for a place like that. It's not necessarily where you're going to spend a night, but it is someplace that is going to give you access to a major medical.
I guess maybe just to build on that question a little bit, one of the things that I was thinking about with the community health centers and stuff is that I'm curious for how you all see the relationship between private sector and the public sector, particularly as it relates to healthcare, right? I mean, I know that in Pennsylvania, there was some work done looking at how you have these, we see consolidation in our entire economy, right? We're kind of an antitrust nightmare, and healthcare is no exception. So you see these big conglomerates that are essentially purchasing rural clinics, and then they're not profitable, so they're just closing. And so, but there's also other ramifications as well. So I was curious what your thoughts are on for dealing with the rural kind of healthcare crisis as it relates to this issue of privatization of public offering. Curious if you all have thoughts on that.
On like our next panel has B. Shannon on it, so I'm sure she has thoughts as well. So, I mean, I think, well, the thing with, you know, I think there's the same, especially with like local government, it's like worst first. So it's like the places, that's where government shows up, is in the places that have that deprivation of private interest. And so, you know, you see, maybe it seems attractive at a time to purchase these rural places, but how long, you know, why were they public in the first place? And so I think there's just been, I mean, we're in decades of like federal decline in kind of community-based resources. And so I think we're seeing some of the ripple effects of that in terms of the ability of communities to uphold these local institutions that provide needed services.
But the critical access hospitals, the designation that's kept most rural hospitals afloat, is a marriage of private and public. And it seems to work pretty well, and it's been pretty successful. And I think it's rare that you would see a hospital seek that designation and regret it. So I think that it is a model that many hospitals wish they would have gotten done when it was available to them.
Is there data that that model is less likely to go out of business than the completely public or completely private?
Well, you can be a private critical access hospital. I wager that most of them are private.
What about medical doctors? Is that an issue?
I think
You're
the
talking
per
about
capita, I
nurses.
think per capita, like, yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I've done a little bit of work on this where, you know, you have medical schools provide incentives for like rural physicians, education, make a commitment to work in a rural area. We see that with dentistry. One of the challenges, and I think we're a group of, demographers who really play a role, is usually those programs, the determination of where people need to serve is based on rural or urban definition, when there's such wide variation. So we did this, a look at this in Mississippi. What would it change in terms of where physicians are located through this program if you also accounted for physician age? So saying not only is it a rural county, but is it a county where there's a much older average physician age? Because that really transforms where people are going to be.
I can give you a personal anecdote with a member of my family who has this MD, did one of these student loan things where they were supposed to come back to the community and serve. Well, the big cities just pay off that. They just pay it off and they did. So there's all sorts of difficulties.
There's another problem. It used to be called the National Health Service Corps, may still be. And that's that the idea is that they pay for your medical school, a part of it, and then you owe a certain number of years to practice there. Then the question is retention. So after the debt is paid, a lot of the people move somewhere else. So was that worth the investment for that community?
Yeah, so I was wondering if each of you have an example of a place or a program that has done a good job of addressing some of the issues that you pointed out.
John, do you want to repeat that question?
So to the folks listening virtually, the question was, if our panelists have examples of their particular issue, locations where those issues are being addressed successfully.
I'll jump in while my colleagues think. I mentioned this national team. One of the things that around broadband education, one of the things that we've done is pull together from across the states what are, like, we think, really good models of what role universities can play with helping communities on this. And one of the things that we did was bring together folks from the University of Missouri system and some folks from Washington who had come up with, Washington State, who had come up with different models for engagement. One around kind of community organizing and helping communities to develop the plans that they want for broadband access. And then another focused more on digital literacy, and then connecting them with people from across the country that are trying to do that work. And to build up the capacity, right? So it's not just working with local communities and working with the university, working with extension, but also even how do you interface with the providers? And they have a whole list of great examples, lessons learned that can be pulled from that. And what we're hoping is that then that kind of training can be provided across the country.
I don't have like a specific example, but I will say, like, the research would talk about the importance of intergovernmental collaboration in building capacity. So, you might not have in your own community the capacity, but maybe within 3 or 4 counties, can you apply for a joint grant to try to channel some form of economic development in the area? And so we see repeatedly that intergovernmental collaboration is really important for kind of spiraling up some of the capacity. And then also interagency collaboration within government. So collaboration. But, it's hard when so much of the economic development model has been competitive. It's a barrier for these communities to get out of the competition mindset into a collaborative mindset around those resources.
Yeah, I don't really have an example. I'm not sure what the issue is in terms of what a community can do. Does the community want to push people away, or do they want to attract them? And again, part of different immigrant populations. I mean, the thing that I've seen is that the local business of these want to grow markets, they want to grow the community, want to provide a labor force that can do the work. But the local people who aren't in the business community, they want something different. They want to maintain their way of life. They want to keep their kids around. They want to invest in the schools and the hospitals. So there's a lot of competition. I remember talking to one guy who was he was working really hard to bring in immigrant populations. And I said, did you talk to the people in your community at all about this, or just amongst your pals? And he said, oh, I guess we haven't really talked to anyone else. So I mean, this is a case. I think this is one of the big issues that every community is going to have to face. This reminded me too of thinking about DeSantos, and just mentioned this earlier to David and Abbott, not to get political here, but sending undocumented immigrants to Martha's Vineyard or to
Kamala Harris's house.
yeah, wherever. And, you know, all I ask to recommend is send them out to some disadvantaged or impoverished rural area. See, you know, maybe they can help those. I'm being a little bit facetious here, but you know, a sanctuary city. There's a question back there.
I have a question for Paige. I was interested, you mentioned intergovernmental cooperation and sort of shared services models. And I'm interested in the survey, did you ask around like whether local governments had, say, a council of government, or I'm just interested in like maybe the county doesn't have an economic development professional, but maybe there's a cog that covers 7 of them, and they have an economic development professional, and what would those disparities between micro, metro, and remote areas look like if you accounted for sort of shared staffing in a model like that? Is that something that was available, or?
Yeah, I don't think we asked about that. We asked about intergovernmental collaboration, and in a longer talk I have slides on it that, and generally, you know, it follows kind of that gradient where urban areas are more likely, and it declines across the rural urban interface of, you know, the amount or the number of governmental units that they're likely to collaborate with. And then, I mean, I think, you know, we see the idea there in a lot of regional development authorities, that there's the idea that you're providing those external boots on the ground in terms of administrative capacity. And so that's obviously been used historically as a strategy for, you know, providing regional coordination of economic development strategies. So there's models there, but we didn't collect any, at least off the top of my head, about that overlay of those things.
Right, we're about at time. Should we take one last question from?
Well, this is going to be harder than it sounds. There are a good 8 questions, all connect the idea of healthcare, internet, and the various new types of hospitals that are out there, such as the rural emergency hospital model, or CAHs as well. I don't even know if there's a question, but it's clear that it's integrated, that health and the internet are closely related to each other. Any comment? I mean, thoughts. Let's take thoughts.
Well, you know, what I would say to start off is that, yeah, there's no question that our ability to expand access to information and services around health is improved by broadband, which also demonstrates the real challenge, and kind of coming back to David's comment of that we need to think about broadband as a basic service in our world. And the other thing I would say that kind of gets to Sean's earlier point is that there are all types of great applications of telehealth, telemedicine that can be applied, but it's not going to be one thing that saves access to healthcare, and that there are some trade-offs and some costs and things to that we really need to consider. So, you know, I think what's pointed out is that, you know, this issue of broadband is connected to all of these other issues. We need to think about it in that kind of integrated way, rather than as just a separate issue, which is what we tend to do. And it's the same way if we're talking about water infrastructure and services. It's inherently connected to all the other issues. We need to kind of approach it in that way.
I add one thing to this. We've talked about access to broadband. We talked about having a computer, multiple computers, PCs and all. But the other part to this that I've come across is you need an IT person too. You need somebody to run these things. And, that's not easy to find in many parts of the world.
I just piggyback on John's comments. Another limiting factor with respect to using broadband in health, including mental health, has to do with insurance. I am on the board of directors of a local mental health organization in Ithaca, and during the pandemic, all the mental health went, online. But certain health insurers will not pay for it, and so you've got all these different health insurance providers, and they have different criteria, and it's an administrative nightmare for, say, a mental health organization to determine who has access to what and what will be reimbursed. And so that's a real issue, the health insurance part of it.
There's another aspect to that was raised by one of our people online, Krista Payne, who said, even if there are enough workers, whether they be healthcare workers or IT people, that does not necessarily mean that individuals in the community will actually use those services, because they're not always delivered in a culturally appropriate way. And living in Utah with as many American Indians as we have, that's just one.
Great panel again. Thanks, everyone. We're going to pause now for 30 minutes, eat a little lunch, and then we'll come back with our final panel on inequality and health. Welcome back, everyone. We are about to embark on our third and final panel of the day. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to our moderator, David Brown.
I hope everybody had a good lunch. Same for the people out on Zoom land. So this panel focuses on poverty, inequality, and health disparities. Again, I'm David Brown. I'm your moderator. We have three really fine panelists. We're not going to go in the order that's shown on the handout. We're going to, but let me introduce everybody. First speaker will be Leif Jensen from Penn State University. Second speaker will be Kenan Monnet from Syracuse University. And our third speaker is Malia Jones from the University of Wisconsin. And Malia is in Wisconsin now. And so she will be speaking to us remotely, and hopefully we'll make that work. So Leif, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thanks so much, David. So this is a panel on rural poverty, inequality, and health disparities. And so what I'm going to do is just provide a little bit of background to get us started. So first on rural poverty. So it exists outside of the media spotlight, and it's fair to say that rural poverty has been somewhat neglected. This hasn't always been the case. The famous presidential commission behind the People Left Behind report of 1967 drew attention to rural poverty in Appalachia and elsewhere. But generally, rural poverty has not garnered a lot of concern. For years, rural demographers, including myself and others maybe in this room, have been eager to point out that actually poverty rates are higher in rural than urban America. And in fact, officially that remains true. The rural urban gap has narrowed since the 1960s, but the rural poverty rate stands at 15.4%, a few percentage points higher than that in urban areas at 11.9%. However, we know that there are well-known flaws in the official measure of poverty in the United States. Importantly, that it doesn't account for cost of living differences across places. And so the so-called supplemental poverty measure corrects for these flaws, and as a result, suggests that poverty rates are actually slightly higher in urban America after all. Regardless, rural poverty remains an issue of concern, and it's especially acute in some parts of the country. These are maps from the Economic Research Service, the crown jewel of the federal government, at the USDA. The map on the left shows persistently high poverty rates, counting high poverty counties in red. And these are counties that have had poverty rates of 20% or more consistently since the 1980s. And there are 310 such counties, and 86% of them are rural. The spatial pattern here is also telling. You can see Appalachia and also areas of high minority concentration, the Black Belt, the Delta, border regions, and counties with Native American reservations. The map on the right shows counties with persistently high child poverty. And you can see that there are more such counties. They are also disproportionately rural, and they show the same spatial clustering in Appalachia, the Deep South, and elsewhere. Next slide. So of concern to this panel also is inequality. And these maps are from a USDA funded study led by my colleague Brian Peaty at Penn State. David Brown and I are also co-PIs on this project. And in this project, we've been studying levels of income inequality among US counties. And so here, the counties in darker red have higher income inequality as measured by the Gini index. And comparing left to right, we're comparing many decades, 1970 compared to 2016. And comparing these maps, you can clearly see a rise in income inequality over time. Our study also found consistently higher income inequality in rural counties. However, we also show that the increase over time is more apparent in urban counties. That should be evident. I'm using rural and urban for metro. Next slide. So finally, those in need often rely on social insurance or other government assistance at times. And suffice it to say, they are important for alleviating poverty. The prose on the left describes work by the Carsey School of Public Policy, and it finds that key government programs keep more rural than urban residents out of poverty. On the right is research by Jennifer Warlick, which shows that several programs, Social Security, SNAP, SSI, and others, reduce poverty more so in rural than urban areas. Still, there are folks who don't receive benefits even though they're eligible and in need. And so a perennial problem in rural areas that we've kind of touched on already today is the lack of access and availability of some programs. And many would argue also the problem of greater stigma associated with assistance received in the countryside. So that's just a little bit of background, and I'm going to turn it over to Shannon.
Thank you. I'm here to give just a broad overview of rural population health and health disparities. And I think this first figure is pretty striking when you look at what happened in 2020. But I want to make 3 points during my 5 minutes. And the first is that the rural mortality penalty is long running, it's wide, and it's growing even before COVID-19. Rural areas have long had higher mortality rates than urban areas. The gap emerged in the 1980s for males and the 1990s for females. And the gap has grown over time, with especially large increases since the early 2000s. With the emergence of COVID-19, obviously, you can see that rates increased dramatically in 2020 for both metro and non-metro areas. What you can't really see from this graphic is that the increases were larger in non-metro areas. You can see that among males, the overall non-metro mortality rate was actually higher in 2020 than it had been since the late 1990s. And among females, the non-metro rate is the highest it has ever been over the past 40 years. So any progress that was made in improving mortality in non-metro areas for females in particular has been lost due to the last year. And rates continue to increase at a faster pace in non-metro areas in 2021. So when we see this next year, we're going to see an even larger bump and an increase in the gap. I don't show separate figures here by age group, but mortality trends are especially concerning for working age adults, so those ages 25 to 64. Increases in working age mortality have contributed most to the US's overall mortality penalty relative to our 18 high-income peer countries. Overall stagnation, divergence in life expectancy relative to our peer countries has been driven by working age adults. And I want to point out here that you can see that the 2010s have been an especially troubling decade for mortality, even before COVID-19. The declines that we were seeing in mortality, or the sort of declines in mortality, stagnated during the last decade. COVID certainly completely has changed the mortality landscape, but the US was already performing badly relative to our peer countries. And that's especially the case in non-metro areas. Next slide. The second point that I want to make is that no single cause of death is to blame for these disparities or for the growth in the non-metro mortality penalty over time. The disadvantage is pervasive across multiple injury and disease categories. This figure shows the top 10 causes of death in metro and non-metro counties in 2020 by age group and by metro status. I show rates and causes separately for ages 1 to 24, 25 to 64, and ages 65 and older. And you can see that across nearly every major cause of death, non-metro rates are higher than the metro rates. The exceptions include drug overdoses and homicide, which are higher in metro areas. But looking just at the working age group, the one on the left, as examples here of the gaps, the rates from cancers are 29% higher in non-metro areas. Heart disease deaths are 43% higher. Transport accidents are 85% higher. The suicide rate is 58% higher. Chronic lower respiratory disease rate is twice as high in non-metro areas as in metro areas. In the older age group, we see high non-metro rates for every top 10 cause of death except Parkinson's disease, which is the 10th cause. That one's comparable in metro and non-metro areas. These figures don't show changes over time in these causes of death, but I've shown in other research that across most causes of death since the 1990s, rates have either declined less in non-metro areas for things like cancers, heart-related diseases, or they've increased more in non-metro areas. For example, from suicide, alcohol-related diseases, respiratory diseases, diabetes. Now, that there is no single cause of death that is driving these trends clues us into the fact that there is not one underlying explanation for these causes. It's not just health behaviors or just healthcare access and quality. Instead, it's systemic failures across a wide array of US policies and institutions that have contributed to rural America's troubling mortality trends, but also to the US's performance relative to our peer countries. Next slide. The third and final point that I want to make during these 5 minutes is that rural areas aren't homogeneous, as we've heard several times today. There's substantial within rural heterogeneity in mortality, just as there is with the other outcomes that we've been discussing. And although some types of rural communities have experienced pretty large increases in mortality over the past decade, places that you can see here that have high mortality rates in 2017 to 19 are places that have experienced a lot of increase. Appalachia, certainly, parts of New England, much of the heartland, but other places experienced improvements, again, before COVID. A lot of those improvements have been wet to us since COVID. So for example, in parts of Texas, there have been declines in mortality, parts of the southern coastal region, parts of the Northeast, parts of the Pacific. And then I think we're going to talk about the relationship between health and poverty as part of our discussion. One question might arise, is this really just driven by poverty? And while it's certainly true that it's better to not be poor than to be poor in terms of your health, poverty isn't the only explanation, and you can see this from the map. So some of the places that are persistent poverty counties also have among the highest mortality rates in the country, but that's not always the case. There are some places that aren't persistently poor that are also performing very badly on population health. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Malia, who I think has much more to say about COVID-19.
Could I interrupt for just a moment, please? There's a question online about data, and I think it's worth clarifying. Are rural areas inclusive of tribal communities?
If the county that the tribal community is in is delineated as non-metro, then it would capture that tribal community. Not all tribal communities are located in non-metro counties. Some are located in metro.
Thank you.
All right, Shannon, thanks for that talk. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. I am sorry I'm not there in person today. I had planned to be, but ironically, I got COVID, so I am joining you from my basement. My name's Malia Jones. I'm a demographer and health geographer at UW-Madison in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology. And what I study is health disparities and infectious disease. And today I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on rural places. Broadly speaking, rural places were hit extremely hard by the pandemic. You've already heard a little bit about that. Though skyrocketing case numbers and overflowing hospitals in rural places were maybe less likely to be in the news, I think that's at least in part because there aren't that many hospitals in rural places, right? Rural places did experience dramatic increases in already higher death rates, and without good access to healthcare, pharmacies, vaccine clinics, hospitals, broadband, or even grocery delivery services, rural places were also hit really hard by the opportunity costs of living during a pandemic. So this particular study that I'm going to present, we looked closely at the factors that led to rural disadvantage in reported cases and deaths during just one phase of the pandemic. But I think this can really be taken as part of a larger story of the pandemic's effect on rural communities. What we've done here is look at what happened in terms of COVID-19 cases reported and deaths from COVID during wave 4 of the pandemic. And we're talking about wave 4 being the combined period when the Delta wave hit the US in fall of 2021, and then almost immediately following that, the devastating Omicron wave that hit in early 2022. We chose this period of the pandemic for a couple of reasons. First, it was after many normal activities had started to resume, such as in-person school, and there was variation in how that played out across the rural-urban continuum. Many parts of the country had dropped mask orders by that time, for example. Second, by the time the Delta surge arrived in the United States, there was near universal access to vaccinations for adults. And going into this, it was my expectation that differences in vaccine uptake would have a really big impact on the number of cases and deaths and the disparity between rural and less rural places. And finally, because of just the sheer number of cases during wave 4, there was really no part of the country that was not affected. And this unfortunate circumstance allows us to look at what happened in some of the more remote areas that had previously not experienced a big surge in COVID cases. So in this work, we use the USDA's rural urban continuum codes to define rural and urban. This is a 9-category system. And we chose that because it offers a county level measure that is on a continuum rather than a dichotomy. When we look at the gross number of COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 people during wave 4, we do see higher death rates per capita in every county type as compared to those large metro areas. Death rates per capita got as high as 170 per 100,000 people in counties defined by smaller towns and rural places. This compares to around 100 deaths per 100,000 in the largest metro counties. We also looked at the reported cases during wave 4 of the pandemic, and we do see a similar pattern, although it's eroded a little by the fact that there was likely less testing and reporting of COVID cases in more rural areas. So we look next at the all-important question, why? What characteristics explain the higher death rates in rural America during this phase of the pandemic? And we find that, of course, the relatively high number of older people was a large influence. Age is a major risk factor for death from COVID-19, and rural places do have older age structures. But even after accounting for the age differences, we also see the effect of poorer overall health prior to the pandemic, higher poverty rates, and lower educational attainment, with the lower health literacy that goes along with education. These socioeconomic factors do explain most of the rural disadvantage in deaths. Some pandemic-specific behaviors also explain the higher death rates. Lower vaccination rates did play a role, although not as large a role as I expected. And really importantly, lower engagement with behavioral preventions like wearing masks played quite a large role. We don't have a good direct measure of this, so we actually use the proportion of votes for the Republican candidate in the 2020 presidential election as a proxy. And we have some good evidence that this is quite a good proxy for wearing masks and other behavioral protections. So together, age structure, socioeconomic and behavioral factors do explain most of the rural disadvantage in wave 4 of the pandemic. And I think this is useful as we try to understand what is needed in rural places to improve health outcomes and reduce health disparities. Investments in rural health, anti-poverty, job, and education programs could go a long way to addressing these differences. And again, we did also look at cases reported during wave 4 and their covariates. Age was actually a protective factor when it came to the number of cases. So it's not just that there were more cases and therefore more deaths. There were actually fewer cases in older places and yet more deaths. This suggests that older people were either more cautious, had lower exposure risk, or were less likely to test for COVID-19. Vaccinations were not an important factor for the number of cases. However, health status prior to the pandemic and the socioeconomic and behavioral factors were important risk factors for the number of cases.
Thanks very much, Malia. So we have our panel chatted a little bit before we came here and had some questions we thought might start our discussion. And so we'll chat a little bit among ourselves, including hopefully Malia, if you can hear me. You can hear me? Okay, so.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so and then we'll take questions from the audience, both here and at home. So there seems to be this sort of association between disadvantage of various kinds, mortality, morbidity, and persistent poverty. So would ameliorating poverty contribute to diminishing these health disadvantages? And if not, what other kinds of interventions would help to alleviate these health and morbidity disadvantages?
Going big right away.
Is it just poverty?
It's, like I said, in the slide with the maps, it's better not to be poor, certainly, than it is to be poor. We know that socioeconomic status is a fundamental cause of health and health disparities. So certainly there's a very strong correlation between poverty rates and poor health and high mortality rates. And that's for a variety of different reasons that have to do with access to healthcare, knowledge about health promoting behaviors, the ability to purchase healthy foods and engage in physical activity, knowing when to see the doctor. So poverty matters, but the big causes of death, cardiovascular disease, cancers, drug overdose, they're driven by things that ameliorating poverty alone will not help. And we have to think about this in the context of the US's overall health profile. We are the worst performer
in health and mortality relative to all of our other high income peer countries. That means this isn't about poverty alone. There's something about the systems and structures of this country that promote or manufacture poor health. And in the US, far too often and for far too long, the approach to dealing with health problems has been post hoc, and it's been downstream, where we attempt to deal with problems after they arise rather than preventing them to begin with. It's wasted time, it's wasted money, and it's cost lives. So it's not poverty alone. Poverty contributes, but there's some larger structures that I can talk about later in this country that contribute to poor health for everyone.
Malia or Lay?
Yeah, I would just agree that when we look at what happened with COVID-19 and disparities, I think what COVID-19 did was reveal some very weak points in our healthcare system, pre-existing health status, and other health disparity issues in the United States. It didn't cause these problems, but communities that were already suffering were more heavily impacted by what happened during COVID-19. And we can see in the data that I showed that it's not just poverty. There are structural factors, there are behavioral factors, and in addition to poverty, there are other socioeconomic factors like educational attainment at play.
So, yeah, I mean, I just do a diagram in front of me, you know, with death and poverty, and I think we need to think about those things that are causing both higher poverty rates and poor health in places. And so, like Paige's work, that Paige Kelly's work earlier, is one example of a community asset, strength of local governments that's at play, and there are so many others.
So are any of these factors that contribute both to high poverty and high mortality primarily rural, or is this independent of the scale of community? In other words, is this a rural issue, or is it a national issue, or how?
So I think that there are some policies and some structures in the US that are going to disproportionately affect rural communities because of things like lower educational payments. Let's think about education for a minute. Education is becoming an increasingly important driver of health and mortality in the US. The educational gap has increased more than most other types of characteristics that we think about when we think about health disparities. What my colleague Jennifer Karras-Montes has found is that being of low education matters a whole lot more in some types of policy context than other types of policy contexts. And that is because education is a sort of bellwether against adverse environmental context. Whether we think about that environmental context as being economic or physical environment or built environment, people who have resources in the form of education and income are able to sort of weather the adverse environmental experiences of, say, living in a state that has really low tobacco taxes. Smoking is one of the primary drivers of cancer mortality and heart disease mortality in the US. It should come as no surprise to all of us that therefore lung cancer mortality rates and heart disease mortality rates are much lower in states with higher excise taxes on tobacco. But it turns out that those taxes or lack thereof matters a whole lot more for people with low education than they do for people with high education. So if you're a low educated person living in a state with what could be thought of as a health harming environment, low education taxes, easy access to firearms, a lot of environmental pollution, no protective labor laws, then you're going to be harmed by those policies much more than if you have high education and are able to weather those health harming environmental characteristics.
Leah, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think that another way to look at the same thing that Shannon is saying is that there can be a piling up effect of multiple multiple challenges. And even when some of those challenges seem relatively small on their own, if I were to lose my broadband access for a week, it probably would not have a huge impact on my overall health outcomes, because I have a lot of other resources to draw on. In places where resources are low across the board and there's sort of, you get multiple risk factors piling up on one another, I think that's where you really see those differences start to come out. And we do see that happening in rural America versus in as compared to suburban and the biggest metro areas.
Eddie, do we have any questions from the audience? Come on, 60 you guys are still on. We need some.
I have one.
Okay.
I guess I had a question for y'all's thoughts on, I'm thinking about the link between poverty and mortality, right? Like there are places that have persistently high poverty rates. People tend to bounce in and out of poverty. Obviously once you fall into poverty, you're more likely to fall into it again, but there's a lot of people who are in poverty for a bit and then get out of poverty and then largely are out of poverty. So I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on the kind of long-term health consequences of as a person being in a poverty spell versus living in a high poverty place? And if you have any thoughts on how that either complicates or kind of contextualizes the link that you were talking about.
So,
I mean-
so even if you are not personally poor, if you live in a place with high poverty rates, does that have an impact?
Yeah, but then likewise, then, mortality, except for say like suicide, right, or something that's traumatic, something like heart disease or cancer, that's a long-term thing that takes a while to develop. We don't have a persistently poor under class in the same way that we do people that are constantly churning in poverty. So, what
I mean,
are the,
there is a sizable number of folks who are sort of at risk of poverty,
Right,
right? And they stay at risk of poverty. So even if they might bounce up above for a while, they're still at risk, right? And
Yep.
they're still resource poor, and still dealing with the stresses of being at risk, right? But you're saying, putting aside that dynamic, what are the implications of being in a poor place for
yeah, for your health? Yeah. So what are the implications of living in a poor place for your health? And then similarly for the people that aren't that constantly at risk population that maybe were poor when they were 25 and single, long term, are they also likely still to have that health outcome?
I think the answer is yes. The question is, there are two parts to the question. The second part, which I'm gonna try to answer first, is if you were in poverty a while ago, but you're not in poverty now, say you grew up in poverty, does that have an effect on your health that can be measured long term? And I think the evidence is yes, that there is a long arm of something like low income or poverty on long-term health, right? Health is something that develops across the life course. Even something like suicide is not an instant cause of death. It's a manifestation of mental health struggles that build up over the life course. So you think about growing up in poverty as a child, whether it be that you don't have access to healthy food or recreational environments, or just the constant wear and tear on the body of the stress of being in poverty, that's going to manifest itself into organ effects or stress that leads to heart disease, or the types of behaviors that we engage in as children, the types of foods that we like to eat. For example, you develop an affinity for sugar that then stays with you for the rest of your life. That's not necessarily healthy for your long-term trajectory. So I think even if you manage to achieve upward mobility, where you were born into, especially during those pivotal, first few years of your life, has long-term implications. Regarding the first question, which was about, say you're not a poor person, but you're living in an environment that is high poverty, how will that impact your health? Well, then we go back to this idea of what are the resources that are available in these communities. But more important than that, just what's the general kind of feeling of living in this community? And if a bunch of people are poor, they're downtrodden, they're not happy with their lives, they're not forward looking, well, I'm really optimistic and hopeful about what the future of this place is going to look like,
that's gonna manifest itself at a sort of community group level where everybody feels like it's dragging them down. And so I think living in those types of places, even if you do have more economic resources, still not a happy, healthy place to live, and it's gonna have negative health.
I mean, there is some evidence to suggest that living in a place that has higher inequality is detrimental for health.
Okay, we have one question back here, and then we're gonna go to an audience question.
Okay, my question is, the US does not have Medicare for all, or we do not have a national health system. So, and I think our health indices overall are worse than a lot of other countries. So what role does that have in what you're seeing? And also, it's been indigenous communities and African American communities that suffered disproportionately during the pandemic. So can you address those issues in terms of some of what you're seeing in your data?
Malia, do you want to?
Can someone repeat the question?
Unfortunately, I couldn't hear the question, so you'll have to repeat it to me.
Okay, the question was that the US has got uneven coverage of health insurance. And also, that's the first part of
So
it.
we don't have Medicare.
We don't have a national healthcare system.
Don't have a national health care system. And also that certain population groups like Native Americans and African Americans, Hispanics in certain circumstances have done relatively worse during COVID than others, and probably generally. So what about these determinants of unequal health? And so Malia, I was sort of asking you first because I think you have more focus on COVID. What extent did health insurance or demographic differences contribute to differences in COVID deaths and hospitalization?
Yeah, I mentioned before this idea of sort of a piling up effect. We do see health disparities, COVID outcomes disparities by race, by poverty, by health insurance status, by basically every kind of indicator of socioeconomic status and access to healthcare emerging during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so where we see intersections of those things, it's going to be even more pronounced, right? So where we see a group, like a concentration of Spanish-speaking Latino people in rural places without access to health insurance or health care, we would expect to see, and we did in fact see higher rates of COVID mortality in those kinds of places.
Regarding the lack of universal health coverage in this country is a travesty, and it should not still be happening. It is absurd that we are the only country of all of our peers that treats healthcare as though it's a privilege for those who can afford it and not as a right for everybody. But as long as we are in a market-based system where we treat health as a commodity, we're going to continue to see these kinds of health disparities manifest themselves in multiple different capacities: racial, ethnic differences, rural, urban differences. So healthcare matters, but it's not the only thing that matters, right? At a base level, everyone should have access to healthcare. But even if we did, we would still have differences in policy environments that we live in and the ways those manifest into differences in health outcomes. COVID is a prime example of this, right? So if we look across the country, we have in our system of federalism, we have 50 states that act as though they're 50 different countries, because there was no standard federal response to how we should deal with COVID in terms of mandates or behavioral guidance. States enacted their own guidelines, and they varied dramatically from you have to wear masks to go into public places to it's a free-for-all and we don't have a problem here. And if you wear a mask, we're gonna make fun of you. And you can see those differences illustrated in the maps of where COVID mortality rates are now the highest and where they're continuing to increase relative to where they had the initial blip versus decline really quickly after the first couple of
Eddie?
From Joshua Grove, what kind of policies can be implemented in rural spaces? Really kind of following up on what Shannon just said. What kind of policies can be implemented where localized, specialized economies are intertwined? Counties that are metro adjacent benefit from structural urbanism. What happens to the more remote areas? And it seems as though broadband access is only a Band-Aid.
Hey, panel?
All you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough question. And, you know, the cooler way of stating the question is, should we just give up on places that have lost their economic base? And, you know, is it worth investing resources to try to revitalize such economies around a different economic base? Or, and it's a moral question, really, not for any of not for me to.
Well, it is a moral question. People have the right to live a decent life where they choose to live. If it's simply let the market determine where capital is located, then the neoclassical economic view of this would be that it's bad for the economy to invest in distressed places because they're not as efficient in using the capital, and you get a lower return on your investment. So you shouldn't, as governments, invest in stressed places. It's a natural process, and they should be weeded out. That's the way that looks. But as Leif points out, there's a moral issue here as well, that people should be able to live a decent life where they choose in this country, even if it reduces the overall rate of economic growth in the country. Efficiency and equity, tension in policy.
I would posit too that it's an environmental issue because the distribution of population right now is underwritten by the petrochemical industry and our reliance on it. And if agriculture looks very different, there might be very different population distribution. You might not be experiencing the same sorts of economic declines if we didn't have such incredible centralization of the food.
I have a question for Leif, to get us into a conversation about work and the economy. And that's because we've been talking only about health, and I want to go back to poverty for a minute. So one of the things that we know from your research is that rural residents engage in a variety of informal employment strategies to make ends meet. What can you tell us about what those differences are in informal work between rural and urban areas? Are there different types of activities rural residents do? Are they more likely to engage in informal work?
Yeah, so in some research that I had done along with Jim Slack in the back here in Anticomar, funded by NSF, we had some years ago a national survey of households in the US and looked at the informal economy. And we did find that actually rural households were more likely to engage in informal work. And yes, there were differences in the kinds of informal work where there were some things that were sort of more tied to proximity to natural resources that were more common. And, yeah, to be sure, people engage in informal work as something that's on the side, oftentimes as a complement to regular formal employment. But we also found that informal work is really important oftentimes to help families make it through a difficult month. And that was also more common in rural areas for people to say, yes, the resources provided by this work has helped them get through.
So it's in lieu of income to some extent. Reduces the amount of income you need to. And if I remember the work correctly, it was not the poorest families that were most likely to be involved in informal work. It was ones that had more resources to use in the informal activities. Okay, we've got a couple, we're piling up here.
This is just a comment from Sarah Hewling, who argues that rural disparities impact urban, and that rural becomes therefore part of the real fabric of it. Danielle Rubart has a comment tying back to the earlier presentation. What is happening in terms of health and mortality indicators of rural counties that are now gaining population? She imagines that the challenge is accounting for the health status of the incoming folks. How do we go about differentiating between existing resident health improving versus incoming resident health status?
That's a good question. So for those online who couldn't hear it, Danielle is asking about what is happening in places that are seeing in-migration and how can we tease out the differences in the health profiles between the in-migrants and the people who have lived in the community for a long time. And I don't know that we can do that with aggregate data. That's something that would require individual level data. I want to say something about data in a minute. Don't forget. One of the things that we know about geographic differences in mortality is that when we're looking at heterogeneity across different types of rural communities, the high amenity recreation areas have the best health profiles. And that's largely because of the selection of healthier people into those places. It doesn't mean necessarily that the people who have lived there long-term have better health profiles. In order to tease that apart, we would need individual level data, say survey information, on people who are recent movers versus people who've lived there a long time. On the data issue, you've all seen a lot of data today from the US Census Bureau, from the Centers for Disease Control, from the National Vital Statistics System, and you've seen research that has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, USDA. Those data resources and that federal funding is critical to being able to understand and address rural population issues. So I think we would all in this room encourage our leaders to ensure that all of those agencies receive the funding that they need to maintain and build on the US's research infrastructure, that we are able to do robust population social science research.
Other questions, or should I throw something else up? Oh, okay, Tim?
Yeah, I was curious if Shannon could talk a little bit about the relationship with firearms.
There's a question, if the audience could hear it, is something about firearms and mortality or morbidity.
Yeah, this is, I'm getting all the tough questions. Suicide rates are higher in rural areas than they are in urban areas. Fact. Another fact is that the highest rates of suicide are from firearms. Put 2 and 2 together.
Yeah. We've heard so much about deaths of despair. It's a lot of times seen as a rural problem, a fundamentally rural problem. I don't know what the most recent thinking about this is, but it certainly links poverty and despair and estrangement to alcoholism, drug use, to higher levels of mortality. You guys tell us what the latest view is on that, especially as it relates to rural areas?
Sure.
Do you
So
wanna-
I think,
Can they hear me, do you think?
yeah, Dan asked about deaths of despair and what the current landscape is of those causes of death in rural areas. Here, I think is actually really important when we're talking about the geographic disparities to disaggregate drug overdose, suicide, and alcohol-related deaths, because drug overdose rates were higher in rural areas only for a very short period of time. It was only, in the early 2010s to mid 2010s, when actually the media was really picking up on the problem, that drug overdose rates were higher in rural areas. They have since and before been higher in urban areas, and especially over the last couple of years have increased more in urban areas. And that surge is due almost entirely to fentanyl contamination. So, people who have been using drugs long-term are now using drugs that are increasingly contaminated with fentanyl. Now, having said that, alcohol-related deaths and suicide deaths remain higher in rural areas and have grown at a faster pace in rural areas than urban areas.
So if we want to think about these three as connected, which they very well might be, we might think about them as different outcomes of long-term processes that lead people to not be happy with their lives. And in one way or another, engage in behaviors that shorten those lives. And I also think we need to think about things like diet. And when we're thinking about the types of behaviors people engage in when they're not happy or optimistic about their lives, if you are really, if you think that you have a really great future and you're going to live a long time and it's going to be a happy, healthy life when you're older, then maybe you engage in behaviors now that are protective of that. So you don't smoke, you eat a salad instead of a Reuben, which is a conversation we had last night.
Dan had the salad.
And then, you know, over your adult life, of course, then you live a longer life. But if you're unhappy and you don't see much of a future for yourself anyway, then why not have that cigarette and why not, you know, eat the McDonald's every day, and why not drive fast and do all of those things that end up being harmful for your health? I think about these all as a total package, that there's not just one or two causes of death that despair manifests itself into, that actually, if you look at a variety of causes of death, people who aren't optimistic about the future are gonna, you know, engage in behaviors that then lead to that.
And if I could chime in and circle this back to an earlier point about this sort of neoclassical view of rural areas and whether we have, you know, an economic or a moral obligation to address these disparities, there's actually some pretty strong evidence that when we have groups of people who are not healthy, who are not eating well, who are ending up in the ER with accidents and substance abuse, it's economically very costly. It is not free to society. And in fact, we would be economically in a better place if we were to take care of those sorts of problems. So I think there's both a moral and an economic argument for addressing the package of health behaviors and socioeconomic factors that lead to this rural disparity in health.
Just building on that for Leah and Shannon, I think Shannon, I've heard you talk about like the death of despair stuff, like supply versus demand, in terms of also thinking about it. But like when you're talking about people who are just generally living in the context you described, where the future doesn't look great, what is your kind of preferred policy strategy if you were to try and, I guess, resolve some of these rural-urban mortality gaps, or just generally high or elevated working age mortality?
I guess I'd like to improve the overall health profile of the US. That would be my preferred strategy, because the reason that, I mean, we would always care about disparities, but we care more about disparities because rural areas are doing so much worse from an already bad baseline. So it's not like urban areas are thriving when it comes to health and mortality, not if you compare us to our 18 million peer countries, right? So if we can raise the profile for everybody by, for example, not allowing corporations to add sugar to all of our food, or by, for example, having policies that support workers in labor, that would improve health for everybody, and I think over time narrow that gap as well, because the people who are most disadvantaged by the policies that we have in this country are the ones who, you know, show up in that downward trajectory of high rates of mortality.
I just want to point one thing out. You know, we've talked a lot about poverty and then these other health disparities. Also, from Leif's presentation, there's the whole issue of income inequality. And the US is one of the highest in the OECD countries in terms of our level of income inequality. And our level of income inequality has been increasing dramatically over the last 2 decades. And inequality really is a reflection on social exclusion, because it's not just inequality in terms of access to income, it's in access to all kinds of stuff that we've talked about here today. So yes, it's important to think about poverty, which is a particular kind of inequality, but more generally, I think inequality we should think of. So I have one final question that I think may bring the three panels together. There are three policy spaces that I can think of. There's and eligibility is sort of, has three different levels. One is the individual level. People are or aren't eligible for certain policies. There's the household. Some policies are family or household directed policies, and some are community or you know, collective. So region, counties, whatever. What's the most important level for policy to be implemented at? And or is there some way that we could think about this in a more integrated way? How policy investments, you know, focus or target not just places, not just people, but people in places. Kind of gets to your question about, is it personal poverty or place poverty that's most. So what about that? How, if you were going to design a policy framework, how would you build in, you know, these different levels? Household, personal, community.
Well,
get
I
to
mean,
say that
as
as
an additional preface to your question, I think that's part of the problem. Is policy is makers are not attuned to thinking across levels.
How many of you have heard the river story by the medical sociologist John McKinney? Anybody? This is something that I like to talk to even my intro to soc classes about, is thinking about, is it individual level, household level, is it more macro level? So I'm going to go real macro here, right? The political sociologist John McKinley referred to manufacturers of illness in his research. These are the institutions and policies that create the context that make us unhealthy. And the river story is a story about a doctor who says, sometimes I feel like there I am standing on the shore of a swiftly flowing river and I hear screams for help. And so I dive in, I get this person, pull them back up. And just as I'm bringing them to shore, I hear another scream for help. And so I get them, I pull them back up. And just as I pull them up again, I hear another scream again and again. So I go back in the river and I'm so busy jumping in to save them that I have no time to see who the hell is upstream throwing them all in. I think this gets to the underlying causes of poverty and inequality and poor health in this country, that we have to think about, like, what's the top of the river making all these people poor and sick and die at a premature rate? We spend a lot of time in the US trying to invest in individual level downstream interventions. It's costly and it doesn't save lives. So maybe we should just take a radical approach here and go way upstream and try to implement policies that will have the biggest impact on the biggest amount of people.
Any of the other panelists and or audience want to jump into this? Okay, we got some more there.
I have, this is an interesting comment. Sarah Holing has been online making comments throughout this. She is a sonogram expert, and she is also an X-ray and CT technologist in rural healthcare. She has been providing all ultrasound, and she says that rural healthcare is actually more efficient than urban healthcare because everybody is cross-trained. Essentially what she's saying. It costs more to provide healthcare at a base level for overhead expenses, but get a return over time in more efficient resource utilization, doing more with less over a period of time. And I just thought that was an interesting comment and useful for the kinds of things we're trying to do. And several people keep saying, do you think our congressmen or presidents or anybody else is hearing what you guys are saying? And I refuse to answer that question.
But you've seen that we've had a lot of comments from people that have discipline that's within the room and. So we have one final and then.
Could I just ask one question related to what you just discussed? How would you characterize the social security under this person, household, wife?
Person.
Well,
Really?
but it
It's
has
family, it's
aspects of,
Household and community
Household.
too?
Well.
yeah.
Also to the extent that the spouse gets benefit after the other spouse passes away.
Survivor.
Well, or is it a household out of poverty?
Well, could I just push back and say I would characterize as worker, that most of our social security is tied to employment and work and not actually about being an individual or a household or family.
You were saying, where does it flow to?
Well, I'm just saying, it seems like it's one of those few programs that impact persons, households, and community. So,
Certainly in a rural context, it's one of the major sources of income.
that's what I mean. I mean, it's one of those
And
few
work,
programs.
that I noted earlier by the car seat folks shows that Social Security brings more rural folks than urban folks out of poverty.
And don't forget that it
And
makes you eligible for
therefore-
Medicare.
Therefore, looming threats to Social Security
Right.
are bound to hurt rural places.
Well, my point was just that it's one of those few programs that seems to span the whole range of helping individuals, households, and community.
And it was a universal program. I mean, mainly to workers, but it was made universal across the country. And therefore, did what it was intended to do.
Yet here we are.
Okay, so let's hear it for our three panelists. And I'm turning it back over to our leader.
I just want to thank everyone, especially the presenters, panelists, and moderators, the people at home, wherever you are joining us today virtually. Thanks very much for your great questions. Special thanks to Sarah and Mark at Penn State setting us up for a successful Zoom experience. Thanks for joining us. Look for the recording on our website, rprn.org. Thanks.